Psychoanalytic Concepts of Intersubjectivity and the Analyzing Instrument, a Historical Review. Intersubjectivity, a Psychoanalytic Journey from Freud to Renick. A brief summary. This briefing document reviews the evolution of key psychoanalytic concepts from early Freudian ideas to more contemporary perspectives, focusing on the development of intersubjectivity and the analyzing instrument. It traces how the understanding of the analytic relationship shifted from a one-person to a two-person psychology, emphasizing the mutual influence and unconscious communication between analyst and patient. Foundations, Freud's early ideas and unanswered questions. Sigmund Freud laid the groundwork for the concept of intersubjectivity, even if he did not fully develop it. His Big Bang statement from Recommendations to Physicians Practicing Psychoanalysis, 1912, is central. The analyst as a receptive instrument. Freud proposed that the analyst must turn his own unconscious like a receptive organ towards the transmitting unconscious of the patient. This analogy of the telephone receiver highlights the idea of direct, unconscious communication between minds. Reconstruction of the unconscious. The analyst's unconscious, through this reception, is able to reconstruct that unconscious, which has determined the patient's free associations. Unexamined linkages. Freud hinted at a link between the analyst's evenly suspended attention and the patient's free associations, but this connection remained largely unexplored in his work. Direct unconscious communication. Freud, 1915c, explicitly noted the remarkable thing that the UCS of one human being can react upon that of another without passing through the CS. He recognized this as deserving closer investigation, but never returned to it, shifting his focus to intersystemic relations, conscious, preconscious, unconscious, and later to the structural theory, ID, ego, superego. 2. Early pioneers, expanding the scope of analytic interaction. A. Sandor-Ferenczi, mutuality, introjection, and countertransference. Ferenczi, a close contemporary of Freud, pushed the boundaries of the analytic relationship, emphasizing mutuality and challenging the rigid one-sided approach. Mutuality and shared disclosures. Ferenczi advocated for greater mutuality between analyst and patient, even experimenting with mutual analysis, where analyst and analysand took turns. This blurred traditional distinctions and was controversial. Introjection. In contrast to Freud's concept of projection, expelling unpleasant impulses, Ferenczi, 1909, coined introjection, where the neurotic helps himself by taking into the ego as large as possible a part of the world. He added an object relational component, seeing neurotics constantly seeking for objects with whom he can identify himself, to whom he can transfer feelings, whom he can thus draw into his circle of interest, i.e., introject. Significance. Both projection and introjection became crucial mechanisms for understanding how individuals, including the analyst, relate to other minds, and how unconscious communication occurs. Positive use of countertransference. While Freud, 1910b, admonished analysts to completely overcome countertransference to remain a perfectly cool object, Ferenczi, 1911, argued that one must also pay heed to this, being induced by the patients. This was a groundbreaking idea that suggested countertransference could be a purpose of induction by the patient, offering valuable insight. B. Carl Abraham, Projection, Introjection, and Psychic Metabolism. Abraham further developed the concepts of projection and introjection, applying them to severe mental disorders and introducing the idea of psychosexual metabolism. Alternation in mania. Abraham, 1924, observed a rapid alternation between introjection and projection in manic patients, describing a pleasurable act of taking in new impressions correlated with an equally pleasurable act of ejecting them. Laying groundwork for unconscious communication, this dynamic laid the foundation for understanding how two minds transmit and receive unconscious communications. Metabolism of the unconscious. Abraham's concept of metabolism suggests a process by which the analyst's unconscious reconstructs the patient's unconscious, similar to Freud's telephone analogy, where projection and introjection are the mechanisms of transmission and reception, and metabolism is the means of processing. 3. Mid-century elucidations. The analyst's mind as a working instrument. A. Robert Fliess, Trial Identification, Work Ego, and Conditioned Daydreaming. Fliess, 1942, provided a detailed internal view of the analyst's mind during sessions, linking it directly to the mechanisms of intersubjectivity. Trial identification, empathy. He described the analyst's work ego as having a capacity for trial identification, commonly known as empathy. This involves the analyst step ping into his patient's shoes and obtain ing, in this way an inside knowledge that is almost first-hand. He explicitly connected this to transient introjection and reprojection. Psychic working metabolism. Building on Abraham, Fliess detailed a four-step psychic working metabolism in The Analyst. The analyst is the object of the transference striving. The analyst identifies with the patient, subject. The analyst becomes this subject. The analyst projects the tasted striving back onto the patient, gaining inside knowledge for interpretation. Risks and challenges. Fliess acknowledged the potential dangers for the analyst's mental health from introjecting difficult transferences and the challenge of ensuring no instinctual additions of our own distort the picture after the reprojection. Conditioned daydreaming. He preferred conditioned daydreaming over free-floating attention, suggesting that the analyst's internal experiences are stimulated by the patient's reactions, rather than solely originating from within. Influence. Fliess's work was foundational in shifting psychoanalysis towards its contemporary form by detailing the internal processes of the analyst's mind, despite his traditional view on the analyst's objectivity. B. Theodore Rake, Reciprocal Illumination and the Third Year. Rake, less concerned with the analyst's instinctual additions, championed spontaneity and intuition, introducing crucial concepts for mutual influence. Reciprocal illumination of unconscious happenings, Rake, 1948, suggested that analyzing another continued one's own analysis, penetrating to profounder depths, implying mutual growth. The third ear, borrowing from Nietzsche, Rake described the third ear as the analyst's attunement to their own unconscious processes, highlighting internal receptivity. Shared dreamy ego state. He emphasized that both analyst and patient enter a dreamy ego state, where the analyst shares with the patient this realm between reality and fantasy, leading to an unconscious sharing of emotion. Rake, 1937. Analyst's growth. Rake was among the first to explicitly articulate the possibilities for emotional growth in both partners of the analytic dyad, moving beyond the idea of the analyst as a static, objective observer. C. Otto Eisenhower, the analyzing instrument as a composite. Eisenhower, an unsung pioneer, significantly expanded the concept of the analyzing instrument, emphasizing its reciprocal nature and the role of visual images. Reciprocal analyzing instrument. Eisenhower, 1957, redefined Freud's analyzing instrument as the reciprocal working together of analyst's attention and patient's associations, stating, "This so-called analytical instrument is the same when it works in the analysand as in the analyst." Limited analyst revelation. Unlike Ferenczi, Eisenhower advocated for circumscribed self-revelation, suggesting that ideas or images that come spontaneously to the analyst's mind during the session should be taken seriously as data for understanding the patient and perhaps even presented to the patient. Importance of visual images. Rooted in dream processes, Eisenhower placed great importance on visual images that enter the analyst's psyche, viewing them as arising from the interplay between the two minds. Visual images take part in representing a given conflict. 1963a. A composite of two complementary halves. Eisenhower, 1963b, explicitly stated that the analyzing instrument is not unitary within one person, but rather a composite consisting of two complementary halves that function as one unit in continuous communication. Shared state of consciousness. He suggested a near identity in the quality of wakefulness in both the analyst and the analysand. 1963c, a merger at the ego state level, paralleling Fliess's trial identification. Preconscious visual images and communication. Eisenhower saw preconscious visual images in either partner as evidence of the analyzing instrument at work. He provided an example where an analyst's spontaneous visual image, Mona Lisa, fostered a greater openness in the patient to previously blocked-off material. 1963d, demonstrating how such images can be a rudimentary form of a communicable formulation. D. Charles Arlo, Unconscious Daydreaming and Co-Created Narrative. Arlo further emphasized the role of unconscious visual processes in the analytic interaction. Unconscious daydreaming. Arlo, 1969a, 1969b, highlighted unconscious daydreaming as a constant feature of mental life and an ever-present accompaniment of conscious experience. Dream along with our patients. He stated that both analyst and analysand engage in unconscious daydreaming, forming the basis for a co-created narrative. In a sense, we dream along with our patients, supplying at first data from our own store of images. We then furnish this picture to the analysand, who responds with further memories, associations, and fantasies. That is, we stimulate him to respond with a picture of his own. This anticipates the concept of reverie. 4. The shift to two-person psychology and enactments. The mid-20th century saw a divergence in classical analysis. Ego psychology focused on structural theory and defense, often viewing countertransference as an impediment, while another group continued to explore unconscious processes and communication. This tension is evident in Fliess's work and the reception of Eisenhower's ideas, which were often seen as too susceptible to countertransference influences. The mainstream American psychoanalytic establishment, influenced by ego psychology, marginalized perspectives that deviated from a sanitized view of the analyst's functioning. The shift towards a two-person psychology, first explicitly defined by John Rickman in 1951 as the psychological region of reciprocal relationships, began to gain traction in the mid-1970s. A. Joseph Sandler, Countertransference and Role Responsiveness. Sandler, 1976, significantly advanced the understanding of transference and countertransference within a relational framework. Transference as actualizing an object relationship. He introduced the idea that transference aims to actualize an internal object relationship of the analysand within the analytic relationship. The patient unconsciously acts to evoke in the analyst a complementary role of that fantasy. Role responsiveness. This role responsiveness is not merely a patient's fantasy, but an actual state of emotional affairs that permeates the subjective experiences of the analyst and analysand. Analyst's task. The analyst must maintain free-floating behavioral responsiveness, a receptive capacity to be placed in various roles. The analyst's distress in such a role is a compromise formation between personal proclivities and the induced role. Gaining knowledge. Through the experience of role responsiveness, analysts gain crucial knowledge of the patient's inner workings. The example of Johnny demonstrates how the patient implicitly understood Sandler's technical suggestion that the analyst become one of the patient's inner objects. B. Theodore Jacobs, Mutual Enactment and Unconscious Resonance. Jacobs, 1991, expanded Sandler's ideas, introducing a two-person dimension to enactments. Unconscious mutual enactment. Enactments are carried out by both patient and analyst, often serving as a resistance to surfacing crucial historical or interactional elements. Analyst's resonance. The analyst is typically drawn into an enactment due to unconscious resonance with the patient's conflict, identifying with an internal object of the patient or a split-off part of themselves. Making the unconscious conscious. For Jacobs, successful analysis of an enactment allows for the emergence and clarification of unconscious conflicts in the patient, aligning with the classical goal of making the unconscious conscious. Bidirectional trust and engagement. Other intersubjective ego psychologists like Boesky, 1990, and Ellman, 1998, emphasize that the analyst's emotional involvement in enactments fosters bidirectional analytic trust, as the patient senses their impact on the analyst. C. Stephen Renick, Irreducible Subjectivity and Co-Created Truths. Renick broke new ground by challenging the traditional view of enactments as errors to be recovered and emphasizing the analyst's inherent subjectivity. Beyond error recovery, Renick, 1993, argued against seeing enactments solely as the skillful recovery of an error. He stressed the value of the analyst's self-analysis in understanding their irreducible subjectivity activated in the clinical engagement. Co-created insight and truths. Renick, 2004-2007, proposed that insight is co-created by the analyst and patient as much as it is something discovered. He stated simply that analytic truths are co-created by analyst and patient, rather than unveiled by means of the analyst's objective observations of the patient's projections. This marks a significant departure from the idea of a preformed truth to be unearthed. V. Reciprocal growth and the co-created narrative. The evolution of these concepts highlights a growing understanding of mutual influence and growth in the analytic dyad. Reciprocal illumination of unconscious happenings, Rake analyzing another, allows the analyst to penetrate, to profounder depths in their own self-analytic work, Rake, 1948. Linked reorganization. Jacobs, 1991, delineated that the analyst's understanding of the patient's troubles is linked to their own life associations, meaning any reworking of the patient's inner world is inevitably linked with analogous reorganizing in the analyst's psyche. Analyst's growth as side effect. Traditionally, growth in the analyst was viewed as a useful side effect of an analysis aimed at the patient's change. However, the text suggests this overarching change is built from micro, moment-to-moment interchanges in each individual hour. Co-created narrative. The shared story of the analytic hour is not solely the patient's or the analyst's, but their conjoint handiwork. This narrative incorporates the highly distilled historical record of each individual's family history, where the patient's representations of his objects stimulate in the analyst the reemergence of effectively charged self and object representations. 6. Key elements of intersubjectivity in classical tradition. The classical tradition contains the foundational elements for a comprehensive theory of intersubjectivity. Exchange across systems. Intersubjectivity involves an exchange between the conscious, unconscious, and preconscious systems of both participants. This is seen in Freud's transmitting/receptive unconscious, Ferenczi's introjection, Abraham's oscillation, Fliess's work ego and conditioned daydreaming, Rake's reciprocal illumination and shared ego states, Eisenhower's analyzing instrument and visual images, Arlo's unconscious daydreaming, and Sandler's/Jacobs actualization. Eisenhower and Arlo specifically addressed the preconscious processes that lead to visual images. Shared emotional field. There is an inchoate intersubjective viewpoint where conscious, preconscious, and unconscious events blend to create a shared emotional field. Fliess's trial identification, Rake's unconscious sharing of emotion, and Eisenhower/Arlo's emphasis on shared dreamy ego states all point to this. The analyst's role initially was to follow the patient's lead, but Eisenhower's example of sharing a visual image hints at the analyst's active contribution. Mutual affective attunement and regulation/co-creation of narrative. The analytic narrative is co-created. While earlier classical analysts saw co-created resistance, Renick emphasizes that the developing narrative is co-created by the interpenetration of the analyst's and patient's psyches, moving beyond the discovery of pre-existing truths to the formation of new constructions as a shared emotional construct. Unconscious communication and meaning-making. The shared emotional field is jointly constructed from the idiosyncratic characteristics of both patient and analyst, and experienced according to each's unique mind. Freud's telephone analogy, Fliess's psychic working metabolism, and Rake's reciprocal illumination capture aspects of this. Eisenhower and Arlo's work on visual images and unconscious daydreaming further details how this meaning-making occurs through preconscious interactions. Ellman's idea of interpenetration for analytic trust also contributes. Multiple pathways of communication. Unconscious communication travels through linguistic, pictographic, extraneous, random thoughts, unbidden tunes, bodily sensations, and even potentially telepathic channels. Verbal/auditory. Freud's telephone analogy. Empathy. Freud borrowed Einfühlung to explain nonverbal emotional transmission. Induced countertransference/projection. Ferenczi, Fliess, and Sandler highlight the patient's unconscious induction of feelings in the analyst via projective processes. Visual images. Eisenhower and Arlo emphasize their importance in shared regressed ego states. Sensory/bodily. Jacobs, 1991, acknowledges tactile, sensory, and bodily carriers. Dreamlike states. Fliess and Arlo note that shared dreamlike states enable spontaneous, unconscious intersubjective work, with Arlo's "we dream along with our patients" being a key phrase. Co-created narrative and historical record. The co-created narrative is influenced by the current psychic issues of both partners and contains a distilled, historical record of each individual's family history. The interaction involves the unconscious linking of the patient's representations of his objects with the analyst's own self and object representations, Jacobs. Mutual growth in the dyad. The intersubjective encounter entails growth for both partners, achieved through the reorganization of aspects of their respective psyches as unconscious work constantly re-narrates the story of the analytic hour. This includes reconstruction of the analyst's childhood, Blum, penetrating to profounder depths of the analyst's psyche, Rake, and self-analytic work triggered by identification with patient's objects, Jacobs. The process of building a joint narrative also fosters maturation, not unlike parenthood.